Here's some of what you missed this morning on the John Fredericks Show.
What do you think we ought to do with Edward Snowden?
Well, he's violated the law and knowingly. I mean, and apparently from information coming out yesterday, part of the reason he took the job he took was so that he could obtain information and violate the law. So we ought to be prosecuting him. We ought to be holding accountable countries, these repressive countries that are giving him harbor. And I ought to think as Congress, now that the information is out to some degree and he's described in some detail what the NSA is up to, I think we ought to be having that debate publicly in Congress about the extent of programs like this. I have been briefed in classified briefings over the NSA program. I encouraged administration officials to become more public about the parameters of the program. I think if U.S. citizens understood some of the parameters of the program, they'd actually feel calmer about it. Snowden has got an axe to grind, and he revealed things that he thought were, showing how bad a program it was. Of course, he didn't reveal the checks and balances, the judicial protections and procedures that have been in place to make this a program of very limited scope. And I think the NSA and the administration should now reveal some of those parameters, because I actually think they would make the American public feel more comfortable with the way the power has been used. But no, we need to prosecute Snowden because he's violated the law knowingly and take action against the nations that are harboring.
Now, if he indeed gets asylum that he applied for in the island of Ecuador, we give Ecuador about, I believe, $15 million. Should that aid be revoked?
I think we ought to tell them that that's what's going to happen if they do it, and they'll make the call. But I don't think we ought to be, providing U.S. taxpayer assistance to nations that are harboring people who sort of knowingly committed crimes of espionage. The other thing we ought to be doing, John, is we ought to be hauling Booz Allen before Congress and finding out how in the heck they could put somebody with such a limited background in a position where they could get this kind of information. I'm all for contractors. I think contractors, if they do a job with a higher quality or a lower cost and they can serve citizens, we ought to use contractors. But I have grave concern about the way contractors are used in sensitive areas in national intelligence, and this particular circumstance is a very, very troubling one. And I've urged the relevant committee here in the Senate, the Oversight Committee, that they ought to be pulling Booz Hamilton up and using them as an example of how much of our intelligence are we outsourcing, and is that a good idea or not?
Are you at a point now, Senator, where you would be open to reevaluating the Patriot Act?
I definitely am, because, I was not in Congress when the Patriot Act was passed or revised. I would love to have that discussion about just the whole range of surveillance topics. And I'll tell you, John, what I really think. The issue where I'm most focused is sort of less the techniques than questions, for example, surrounding the current status of the authorization for use of military force. After 9/11, we passed an authorization for use of military force 1 week later. It was very broad and open-ended in its language, and it's been interpreted even more broadly than the language itself by both the Bush and the Obama administrations. We had a hearing on that authorization recently. I asked administration officials, based on the terms of this, when is this war that we declared on 9/18/01, when is it over? And an administration official said, well, it probably is going to be another 25 or 30 years. If we're in a perpetual open-ended war, then all of these surveillance techniques kind of also become perpetual and open-ended because they're sort of justified by the fact that we're in a war on terror. I think the real issue that we have to grapple with is we ought to be going back into that authorization, examining it. I think we ought to be saying that, now that the war in Afghanistan is winding down and the war in Iraq has stopped, I can't imagine that the Congress that passed it would have thought that the war would continue for 25 or 30 years, even after Iraq and Afghanistan are essentially over in terms of combat operations. So some of the folks on the Intel Committee are really looking at some of the surveillance and other privacy techniques and programs. I'm on foreign relations and armed services. What I want to do is have a discussion about that authorization that was passed right after 9/11, and to determine whether after 12 years it's time to basically say, okay, as Afghanistan winds down, let's close this chapter. Let's get some closure for the nation. Let's celebrate the service and the sacrifice and the dedication of warfighters who've been in war for 12 years. And if we need to have a follow-on discussion about the continuing war on terror and what it means, then let's come up with a new authorization that is a narrowly defined one that has some clear terms, some clear duration. And I think if we do that, I actually think that will go a long way toward also resolving a lot of the issues about the surveillance programs.
Catch the rest of this interview in full tomorrow on The John Fredericks Show. For more information, go to thejohnfredericksshow.com.